my editor on the board, shall we say, Donato Romano, who was the person who kept me to my deadlines, sort of, and certainly was a great help along the way. And finally, let me just say that it's wonderful to see so many familiar faces and friends. Very sorry that we can't meet in person, but this is at least some kind of substitute. So my paper was on the contribution of research to agricultural policy in Europe. And I suppose if we think about the huge scope of agricultural policy, we can talk about the analysis of agricultural policy objectives. Agricultural policy economists diagnose actual outcomes in relation to those objectives, or indeed to overall social welfare. We can evaluate the success or otherwise of interventions and instruments that might bring about change in the actual situation, so closer to the policymakers' objectives. And we can be interested also in the reasons for policy change. I suppose political scientists and political economists tend to ask the question of why we have government intervention in agriculture. The agricultural economists tend more to ask how and how well are the interventions succeeding. So given this huge scope, what I've tried to do is to obviously select a number of themes. I've left out huge areas that you might well think would have been very relevant, partly because they will be covered in other articles in the 10th anniversary series, so particularly on the food policy side, but also on agricultural trade policy, which of course is totally interlinked with agricultural policy itself. But even within that narrower framework, there are issues that I just didn't get the space to cover, things like risk management, for example. But let's hope that some of the themes that I have identified
Allora.
Niente, che succede? Fabio, sai qualcosa? Fabio, hai un telefono a cui chiamarlo?
Emilia ha già provveduto a chiamarlo, adesso aspettiamo che rientri.
Grazie.
Okay, so this is, those are the issues with online webinars, but I'm confident that we are gonna continue pretty soon. And if not, I think we may just alternate and have Jutta speaking before, if this technical issue will not be solved in, let's say, 2 or 3 minutes. Also, let me take this time to remember that we are going to have this short presentation of those 2 papers that are already posted online. Bio-based, as many of us know, and some, of course, do not know, is an open access, free of publication journal. And this is pretty strange formula for a journal but this gives us the freedom to increase as much as we want the standard for the articles that we publish. But it is only to say that, of course, all the papers that will be presented in this webinar series are just freely available, and you can read anytime from BioBase. Also, I want to take 1 minute more to thank really all the new members of the international board for being here. I see many faces and many names connected. I don't want to list any of them, just because I know that I will forget some of them. But I personally really appreciate for being supportive of the journal. And while I was trying to fill those 2 minutes, I think we should be ready to switch to the second presentation, if that is okay for Jutta. And the reason is that we are going to have possibly a short session with a Q&A at the end of the presentation. So I want to try to have 15 minutes at least for questions that all of you may pose in the chat, or just live open the microphone and be possibly short.
Okay, yeah, no problem. I can try to share my screen.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Jutta. And I will actually leave my microphone open, so if it's not disturbing. If not, I will just close.
I think there's a lot of echo if you leave it open.
All right. So I'll close. So anytime you are ready.
Yes, you see my screen? Can you tell me that?
I think that, yeah, Simone has I've seen Simone saying yes. So I'll close, and the floor is yours. Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you very much also for inviting me, and let me also extend my congratulations to the 10th anniversary for the Bio-Based and Applied Economics Journal, and also for the association. At the European Association of Agricultural Economists, we are, of course, extremely happy to have an agreement with the AIEAA and to be able to collaborate on certain things. And so it's a great honor to have been invited to contribute to this decennial issue of the journal, and today to present my work on attribute framing and as it affects consumers' attitudes and intention towards foods. So this is a joint work together with Irina Dolgopolova, who has recently moved to Maastricht University, and 2 of our graduate students, Bing-King Li and Elena Pironen. Yeah, so what is attribute framing? So attribute framing is coming from the area of behavioral economics, I would say, and we see it actually a lot in food choices. Attribute framing refers to presenting food attributes in terms of gains and losses, as often done in food marketing. And from a study we are currently conducting, I chose here a couple of cereal packages, as there are easily found in the German market, and you see that some are marketed with less sugar, with a certain amount of fruit, with high fiber content, with no added sugars, or also with low fat content. And these are basically framing attributes like sugar content, fiber content, and fat content in terms of being more or less in terms of gain or loss. So we conducted a meta-analysis on the results of what has been found in the literature regarding this attribute framing for food consumption behavior. And my presentation will start with an introduction. I will outline the objectives, present the methods and sample, and of course the results and a short conclusion. To just get you all on board, what are framing effects and what is attribute framing? So the framing effect shows that decisions depend on the way in which outcomes are presented. And a general finding has been that gains are valued different from losses. There's a very famous example of Kahneman and Tversky, which is the example of the outbreak of a disease which is expected to kill 600 people in a country. And they asked people how they would vote for alternative programs. Program A would have as a result 200 people saved, and program B would have an uncertain outcome with a probability of 1/3 600 are saved, and with a probability of 2/3 nobody is saved. In comparison to that, they presented programs C and D, and again here people could choose between program C and D. And as you see that basically the outcome is exactly the same of program A and C, but the framing is different. Program A talks about people being saved and program C about people dying. And what has been observed in this choice between A and B, people chose in the majority program A, but when choosing between C and D, people in majority choose program D. So we can observe that that people have a preference for certain outcomes in terms when they are presented in terms of gains, and that people also have a preference for uncertain outcomes when the presentation is done in terms of losses. And that led to this famous S-shaped utility function that we see from a given status quo that is here at the cross of our coordinatory system, and people are risk averse if it's about gains, and risk seeking when it's about losses. So we are now not dealing with framing effects in decision making under uncertainty in general, but this framing effect has been translated to the case of attribute framing, where attribute framing describes the way that product characteristics are communicated. So for instance, as in the figure shown here, meat being 75% fat-free or lean, or 25% fat content. So rather avoiding the fat or including the fat or highlighting the fat. We see a lot, as you saw also in my introductory slide, of this attribute framing in food marketing when we have high versus low content, when we are talking about same meat for meat alternatives, or when we talk about high tech or well, also natural conditions on specific food labels. So what we wanted to find out what the literature says about this use of gain-loss attribute framing in food products, and we conducted a systematic literature review followed by a meta-analysis identifying effects of framing on consumer attitudes and on consumer intentions. So we proceeded as in general in a systematic literature review. We started with 4 different databases identifying 753 publications with a long Boolean search query with an intersection of all these different terms that you see listed here on the left side. Then based on abstract and title, it was looked at whether the research was relevant for our purpose, and we concluded on 36 relevant publications. 16 of those still had to be excluded because of missing mean values or unfitting dependent measures, and we also had an additional search on Google Scholar where we could find 5 additional publications. So in the end, we have 25 publications with 76 different effect sizes in the final meta-analysis sample. And these papers were published between 1987 and 21. So we have these 25 studies with attribute framing, always having either a positive or a negative framing on health or sustainability issues. And we have 76 outcome measures or effect sizes, where 40 outcome measures concern attitudes and 36 concern consumer intentions for buying these specific foods. The sample size of our studies in our sample vary between 25 and 433. So you see a large variation here. 32% of the studies have been conducted in the United States. 13% use product labels to communicate the attribute, and 30% of the studies were done online. Here on the screen, you also see our meta regression function. So we explain the mean of a specific effect size measure by the fact whether a gain frame was used versus a loss frame. So frame as a dummy variable coded 1 if a gain frame was used, whether the sample comes from the US, what the outcome measures, intentions or attitudes, whether the study included an interaction term, for instance, with geographic location, whether it concerned a specific product versus a product category, whether the attribute was communicated via a label or differently, and whether it was done in a student sample or in an online study. Maybe your first interesting result is this distribution over the different years of the studies that are in our sample. So we see an increase in the interest of understanding this attribute framing in food studies, with very few studies published before 2000, and then really speed being taken up. Here you see now the descriptive statistics, and so basically I already mentioned all the different variables we have in the sample. So the most important one we are interested in is the frames, where 1 denotes whether it's a gain frame and 0 whether it's a loss frame. And then we have other control variables included. You also see here the whole sample where we have 76 effect sizes, the attitude sample where we have 40 effect sizes, and the intention sample where we have 36 effects sizes measures in the sample. So we first start off with a meta-analysis, and you see it in the graph here, and we see an overall positive effect as shown by the dashed red line in this picture output from the meta-analysis. So we see that the gain frame results in higher attitudes and intentions than the loss frame. But what you can also see from this graph is that there's a huge heterogeneity in the effects measured. Therefore, we also look at the studies by outcome, looking at attitudes on the left and consumer intentions on the right. And we see that the positive gain frame effect, so that we have a framing effect, depends exclusively on the attitude studies on the left, which is significant, but on the right for the intention, we don't have a significant main effect of the gain frame. Given the heterogeneity, we study further in a regression the different determinants of attitudes and intentions. So again, here we do the meta regression for the whole sample, but also for attitudes and intentions, and we can find that gain frame has a positive effect, and this is driven mostly by the attitude effect sizes. We see that in the US sample, we have a higher intentions, but lower attitudes. And for the whole sample, the total effect washes out. We also see that the interaction effect is important, in particular for impacts on intention. And we see that also whether a specific product is presented has a significant impact, and showing that people can better attribute these attributes to a specific product category rather than a specific product. We also see that for the student sample, we have lower effects, but in the subsample, this does not come out significant. Yeah, so what can we say? Overall, we find that or we detect a framing effect leading to a positive effect of gain framing on attitudes and intentions for the whole sample. But when split by outcome, attitudes or intention, we only find this gain frame effect for attitudes. In general, interaction effects and the setting of the studies play an important role in determining the effect sizes of the meta-regression, and the expression is stronger for product categories rather than for specific products, and effects are more readily observed when labels are used for communication of the attribute frames. Rather than different forms of communication that sometimes are also used in online and experimental studies. Yeah, so that was basically our meta-regression studies, and I will stop sharing my screen here. An important outcome of the study probably is that we have very diverse effects, and I think this is an observation, maybe also in your journal, that maybe really our profession has to do something about replication and getting more robust results in different settings to get really an overall picture of the effects. But I leave that to the discussion.
Thank you very much.
Fabio, you're
Fabio.
muted.
Yeah.
Yeah, just it should be activated now. Yeah. So
Yes.
I was just saying, yeah, it's very insightful, and it comes again without saying that the replication it's a trend we should really encourage. I don't think we should take the lead of this for BioBase, because I know that European Association is doing a great job with the Q Open, and I think the path is already established. But I fully agree that those studies that are replicating or just synthesizing what we know, so the current knowledge, are very valuable. And indeed, I was very happy to see the results of this work, because on a minor side, I've also seen how important is communication framing and all those very important topics in food economics. But I don't want to take any other minute. I want to remember all of us that we are going to have Q&A after the second presentation. I see that Alan is here. So, we just prefer to move on, just to not take out minutes from the Q&A. But at any time you are ready, you can share your screen, and I promise I will stop talking.
I do being kicked out of Teams. I don't know what happened, and because I had my presentation full screen, I just wasn't able to see that I was no longer online. So you'll have to help me to tell me where I had actually got to before I was cut off. So if I go through these slides, Fabio, could you tell me? I guess you saw the outline.
Yeah, I think we were very much at the beginning, but if anyone may help me with this, I would say we will not mind if you go from from here.
Okay, from the beginning. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Well, again, sincere apologies for the technical hitch there, and I can see that it's still full screen, but let me not try to experiment with Teams at this stage. What I should emphasize is, first of all, the objective of the paper. It was to survey some of the principal research contributions of agricultural economists in recent decades. It was limited by First of all, the fact that I was aware that there will be papers in the 10th anniversary series on food policy and trade policy, which of course are intimately connected with agricultural policy, so I've left that to one side. And even within that constraint, there are issues that I'm sure some of you who have been working on these issues will regret that I haven't mentioned them. For example, risk management would be an obvious example. Unlike Jutta's contribution, this is not a systematic review. It's very much simply a narrative review, and I suppose highlights my own personal sense of where the main contributions have been made. So what I've tried to do is to identify what have been the drivers of changes in the research agenda of agricultural policy economists. I take a look in the paper at 2 case studies of particular instruments which have attracted a lot of research, so direct payments and the agri-environment climate measures, and then I make some concluding remarks. So when I look at the way in which agricultural policy research has evolved in recent decades, it's clear that, first of all, there's been a huge scope in the extent of the policy agenda. And I think that's been driven partly by changing objectives of the CAP, but also by changing social preferences and greater awareness, I think, also of the market failures around agricultural production, both in terms of the lack of production of public goods, but also the external costs on public health and natural capital. I think we've seen partly reflecting that broadening of the scope of the agenda, we've seen a diversification in policy instruments. And here, obviously, the move from market price support to decoupled payments and the introduction of voluntary schemes such as the agri-environment climate measures would be prime examples. But I think an important driver also has been this expanded toolbox for agricultural economics and policy research. So this would include greater access to data, but also the advances in computing power, which has allowed much more sophisticated modeling, and also advances in methodology, where I highlight in particular the growing interest in experimental approaches and in behavioral economics. When I try to sort of examine the changing emphases in agricultural policy research over time, I've tried to summarize that in this very schematic diagram here. It's clear that interest in food security and in farm incomes has been a continuing concern. I see interest in the environment becoming more prominent from about the mid-80s. Yes, the mid-80s. And I suppose a particular feature for European agricultural policy research was the interest in the transition process, starting in the 1990s with the move from centrally planned to market economies in Central and Eastern Europe. And I suppose that's perhaps the only theme where we can actually say that that has essentially ceased to be a sort of a focus for research. Of course, there continues to be interest in looking at the performance of those economies relative to the older member states, but interest in the transition process itself has I think moved on. I see an increasing interest in competitiveness issues starting around 1990, when we saw the first reform of the CAP and the move towards a more market-oriented policy. Rural development, of course, has been of interest before, but really crystallized, I think, with the Agenda 2000 communication, and has continued to gain in significance since then. More recent areas, I think, of focus have been the interaction with climate. interest in farm structures. Of course, you could argue that that goes back right to the very beginning of the CAP because of the Mansholt plan, but I do see a much greater renewal of interest and focus on farm structural issues from about the middle of the last decade or so. And then most recently, we see this rapidly growing interest in resilient and sustainable food systems. I don't have time to kind of give you an overview of the main contributions under each of these headings. So let me just take a couple of examples, and if they whet your appetite, hopefully you'll go to read the paper itself. So on the food security side, this has of course been an objective of the CAP right from the very beginning. But national level food security, has not been an issue even since before the CAP came into being. So the focus has been very much on food insecurity at the household level. And despite this, food security remains a very prominent theme in policy debates, although it's used in very different ways by the different actors. So very different framings of the term. And of course, we've seen a further impetus in the interest in food security in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic. Despite what I would see as the remarkable resilience of food supply chains. We've had the recent announcement of the Commission contingency plan for ensuring food supply and food security in times of crises. And I think there's also a revived literature on the conditions for resilient food systems that I'll mention again in just a moment. Farm incomes and research into farm incomes has been a continuing interest for policy researchers. It's of course been also an objective of the CAP. It has various dimensions, the level of incomes, the stability of incomes, the distribution of incomes. You'll all be familiar with the graph that the Commission uses on every occasion to try to make the point that farm incomes lag significantly behind the average level of wages and salaries in the European economy. So the red dots show you the percentage of farm income, agricultural income per work unit relative to average wages and salaries. And it has varied between 40 and 50%. However, there's been a lot of research which has focused on whether there is indeed an income gap between farm and non-farm incomes and the extent to which such a gap actually reflects agricultural specific characteristics rather than other characteristics of farmers and farm households. And if we look at recent research which is focused on household income as recommended by, for example, the European Court of Auditors, and if we control for those observable differences, so we know that farmers tend to be older than the non-agricultural population, they tend to have a lower level of income, they may have a poor health status, all of which would affect their earning capacities. There may also be unobservable characteristics, so that arising from the selection process of the way in which people enter the farm versus the non-farm sector. And if we can control for both these observable and also unobservable characteristics, research by Marino, Rocci and Severini suggests that actually working in agriculture is not an important explanatory factor of these differences. So yes, there are indeed, of course, differences in average farm household incomes and incomes in the non-farm sector, but these are not really focused or related to working in agriculture per se. I suppose a comment I might make with respect to that paper is that the farm household income already includes significant support payments. So if we were to withdraw that support, we might find a somewhat different outcome. And of course, farm households do own substantial farm assets, including land. So there is, included in that farm household income, a return to land. So if we were focusing only on the return to labor, again, that might suggest a somewhat different outcome. But that's clearly a continuing and lively area for research. I'll skip the farm structure and just move to the resilient and sustainable food system research. There has been increased understanding that food systems are contributing to, the multiple and interrelated challenges that we face: poor diets, poor health outcomes, food waste, biodiversity loss, environmental degradation, resource scarcity, inequality, climate change. The list goes on. And what the food systems perspective does is it highlights the interactions, including the sort of synergies and trade-offs between these different policy domains. So rather than looking at each one in a silo, so to speak, it tries to take this sort of holistic approach. I find a sort of a strong normative element in this literature. There's clearly the view, the presumption that business as usual is really no longer a viable option. We need to change food systems, and much of the writing in this area is about how we can bring about that change in a way that is just and sustainable. But it clearly raises a whole set of new research questions: the future of animal agriculture, how to bring about a more circular economy, how to reduce food waste, and so on. Just move now to the two case studies that I include in the paper. As I say, the first is direct payments. It's a policy instrument that has generated much research. There's been obviously huge interest in the distribution of direct payments. We're all familiar with the so-called 20/80 statistic. 20% of the beneficiaries get 80% of the payments. So there's been interest in looking at whether that has changed over time, and as a result of policy reforms such as the introduction of capping or the redistributive payment in the cap. There's also been interest in looking at how dependent farmers are on this support. Of course, if you just look at, let's say, Fadden farm accountancy data, you can see, what is the share in a farm income of the support payments. But that's a very static view. So there has been some interesting research done which has linked that farm accountancy data with a market model to try to take into account what would be the market reactions and indeed the changes in farm production and input use if we were to remove those payments. And the research suggests that not all farm systems would necessarily lose out. Yes, arable and livestock, the grazing livestock farms would certainly do so. But there is, when you take these market impacts into account, you can see that some farm systems, dairying, for example, could well benefit from the removal of support. So, these kind of insights, which you wouldn't simply get by looking at the raw data, I think is something which agricultural policy research can contribute. A huge issue is whether these direct payments have had production effects, because clearly when we do simulation modeling, we need to introduce these payments into the model, and whether we do so in a way that has a production effect or not is hugely important to the outcomes that we will see. Related to the whether there is a production effect or not is whether these payments are capitalized into land values, because if they are indeed fully capitalized into land values, then we will assume that they are less likely to have a production effect. And I suppose when direct payments were introduced, there was kind of rather maybe a naive assumption that yes, they will be capitalized, 100% into land values, and that was the assumption in many of the original modeling exercises. But we've seen a lot of research summarized in a recent meta-analysis, which actually suggests that the capitalization rate, can be relatively low. So anything between 11 to maybe 50%. And what seems to drive this is the fact that the capitalization effect is very influenced by the institutional structure of direct payments. So the link with entitlements and whether we have more entitlements relative to the eligible hectares, the fact that entitlement values can be different, the fact that there are production conditions attached to these payments, which clearly reduces their value, and in fact, of course, that they are time limited. They are not infinite payments, which would be necessary if we were to have that 100% capitalization. So that debate, I think, continues, and it's clearly has a huge importance in the way we model changes in cap payments in order to get these impacts. Do direct payments impact on productivity growth? Again, the theory is ambiguous. You could argue that the payments allow farmers to make investments in improving their technologies, but you could also argue that they have a sort of behavioral effect, that they make farmers less interested in improving their efficiency, and indeed that they may lead to overinvestment in, for example, farm equipment, which also results in inefficiency loss. And again, there's interesting research trying to tease out what the impacts on productivity growth of direct payments are. And then finally, there's been interest in how do they influence the process of farm structural change. Clearly, if we assume some degree of capitalization, so land values are increased, that may make access for younger farmers more difficult. It may also lower the incentive for older farmers to retire, because they have to remain so-called active farmers in order to be eligible for the payments. And we do see some of those hypotheses supported by some of the empirical research. Moving quickly just to the agri-environment climate interventions, these are particularly interesting because they're quite different to the income support instruments. They obviously focus on environmental outcomes. They are voluntary in nature. They are contractual relationships between the paying agency and the farmer, and there is a sort of objective mechanism, the income foregone and costs incurred approach to establish payments levels. And again, we see a sort of a wide range of issues addressed in policy research. How ecologically effective have these measures been? And I was actually quite surprised to see that when you read the literature, there's really rather a sort of negative view, despite the fact that we tend to see these agri-environment schemes as kind of the poster child of the CAP, the sort of approach that we would like to move away from income support and more towards these more targeted payments. But actually, the ecological effectiveness, has not been as high as perhaps we would have liked. Now, that may be explained by some of the other issues that have been addressed. So they are voluntary schemes. So there's been huge interest in asking, what are the factors that determine participation? And to the extent that those farmers that participate are most likely to be already if you like, using the practices or eligible and have to make, very limited change to their farming systems in order to apply. That could be one reason why these schemes are not so effective. And the other may be simply the nature of the contracts, which up till now have tended to be action-based. So they have paid farmers for particular actions, which it is hoped and assumed would have a positive effect on the environment. But maybe well, there is evidence that in fact that may not be the case, and there's been significant interest in trying to look at other contract mechanisms, auctions, results-based payments, and so on, to try to improve on that situation. Expanded toolbox. I've talked really about the greater access to data. We've seen much greater sophistication in the models that agricultural policy economists are using. And we also see the interest in these newer methodologies, particularly experimental economics and behavioral economics. Let me just conclude by making 3 points. It seems to me that with this growing breadth of the policy agenda facing agricultural policy economists, it brings with it a growing need for interdisciplinary collaboration. So, for example, if you're interested in looking at how to incentivize climate action, it becomes, very important to have that link with people who are working in the climate science area. And similarly, in the food policy area, the need to work closely with people who are who have expertise in nutrition and in diets and so on. Of course, traditionally, agricultural economists generally have been seen as effective at working in an interdisciplinary context, partly because their training tended to include, for example, biology and farm management. So that you had that link, if you like, with the natural sciences. I suppose increasingly we see recruits into the profession coming from a more pure economics perspective, and whether we can retain that ability to work across disciplines, I just raise it as a question for discussion. A second issue, which I guess will interest all of us, is whether our research has had any real impact on practical agricultural policy. I give some examples in the paper, but at the end of the day, I guess the use of research is something that is very politically determined. I warn against the idea that policy formation is really based on a sort of a linear, let's gather the evidence, let's see what the evidence says, and then we'll take a sort of a neutral, objective decision. That really isn't how policy is made. And then finally, I sort of return to a paradox of agricultural economics, which was raised in a presidential address by Klaus Henning Hanf 25 years ago, where he commented on the paradox that we had a thriving science, and I think I've demonstrated that we do have a thriving science, but for a shrinking sector, and how to maintain that going forward. He already had identified the expanding agenda, but he was concerned whether we would have the tools and the expertise to actually be as effective in driving that extended agenda as we have been up till now. So, Fabio, let me stop at this point, and hopefully there's a few ideas there for the discussion.
If you can hear me.
Yes, I hear you. So I'm just going to close my screen.
Okay. No, I really appreciate, and I don't want to take advantage of being the moderator because I would have many questions. So let me stop before starting, and let me ask the audience if there are questions for any of the two great speakers that we are having today. So please feel free to open the microphone and just raise a question. It's going to be just easier in this way. If not, I'll take the advantage of being moderator. Yeah, there is Sara Savastano. So I guess she's there first. Please go ahead.
Hi, all. Thank you, everybody, for organizing this very interesting seminar for the presenters. And it's really high quality work, so congratulations. Very quickly, because unfortunately I have to switch to another meeting. And to tell you the truth, this question is not really a question for the speakers, but it's I really ask the help of all of you to push research in a new direction, which is research that is relevant for project and policies. And this is a little bit linked from what Alan has just said at the end of his presentation. How can we translate the results of our academic papers in ideas, in lessons that can feed the design of new projects and programs implemented by policymakers? This is really something important. I had a question for the presentation of Jutta. And if you want, I mean, I don't want to enter into the intricacies of meta-analysis. This is not the question. The question is, if you were to design, to help an international organization to design a new project for developing countries, drawing on the lessons from your presentation on behavioral science, that we're also, in IFAD, we're also integrating behavioral science in the design of new projects. How would you, what are the recommendation that you would give us in order to design a project that maximizes the impact, but for developing countries, because what you have presented holds for developed countries, but in light of the food system transformation and for the work that will be financed for developing countries in the future, we need to draw from the literature and from the meta-analysis that you have conducted ideas to feed the future design, because we need to double the impact by 2030. This is the objective of the SDG, is the SDG 2.3.1, which is at the core of the activities of international organizations like FAO and IFAD. So I'm sorry, I cannot listen the whole Q&A session, otherwise I would have been really interested, but I'm just leaving this question for you to reflect in the future on how to promote the publication of papers that can feed policy, because this is the future of research, at least is what I believe is the future of policy applied research. And I am sorry, I have to go. I will follow up with the speakers. And thank you so much for the invitation and for the organization of this seminar. Over.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I think it's a great insight, but let me try to collect another question, if any, because that's the main scope of these webinars. In the meanwhile, I want to say hi to some colleagues and friends that have joined. If there are no questions on hands raised, I would like to continue to follow up on what Sarah has just said and just ask a couple of very quick questions for Jutta and for Alan. So Jutta has done a great presentation, and she is basically saying that communication play a major role. I was, you know, my attention was caught by one of the last point on the importance of having labels. And so if role of communication is important in food economics, and we also know that we want to influence policymakers, as Sarah and Alan have just said, how we can take advantage of what we know from research to being very communicative with policymakers.
Well, maybe
yeah, please,
try to respond. Yeah, I think it's a very relevant remark by Sarah and also by you, Fabio, on the question of what is a takeaway for policymaking. However, so I think what we saw here is that, for instance, communication of benefits in broader product categories is important, and that people, at least the consumers studied in our sample, were much more inclined to understand the communication via labels. So I know that depending on the country context where you are in, you have less packaged food, and maybe you also work less hands with labels. And we also know from our context that the labels can be effective, but the effect is rather small. So I think in this idea of how to raise policy relevance of the research, I think in a lot of food and nutrition research, we really have to think about combining policy instruments, so that in Alan's overview of what we must do is not only focus on different policy instruments, but maybe also a smart design of how policy instruments can be combined to raise the impact of policy interventions. And I think that applies in the same way to the global north as the global south.
Thank you. I don't know if Alan has a reply. I'm sure he has. We have time, and then we will have a couple of more questions.
Yeah, I mean, it's clearly every applied researcher's intention, I think, that they would like to influence policy. What I sort of concluded was that I think there's quite a lot of evidence that our policy research is that policymakers are aware of it. I quote in the paper a study which looked at the use of academic publications in the regulatory impact assessment process within the Commission. And, you know, agriculture ranked very highly in terms of, you know, simply the citation of research that we would have done. But of course, that's a very different question to asking, has that research actually had a real impact? And here there kind of are two schools of thought. One is that the lack of impact could be alleviated if we simply were to communicate the results of our research better. So you'll see a lot of focus or attention paid to the need that we should write more policy briefs. We should have more stakeholder workshops, you know, to try to communicate our research. The European Association, the British Association produced Euro Choices, again, as a way of trying to improve communication of research results to policymakers. But you know, if you look at the policy science literature, it has a much more political economy perspective. Essentially, our research will be noted, but it will be used in a way that the particular stakeholder finds useful. You know, if we have a result that fits into their particular policy agenda, it will be used, and if it doesn't, it will be ignored. So I think we need to be aware of that sort of political economy background to the way in which our research is taken up. Yeah, thanks.
No, indeed, I thank you very much for this for both replies. You know, I don't want to add anything on this. Let me ask if there are any further questions from the audience. Otherwise, I'm gonna keep another question. I'm not gonna be the shy guy, so let me ask another question that I think it's very relevant. So we all know that, well, let me stop. There is one question. So as I said, I'll stop. Philippe Porfini, our president. So please.
Thank you very much, Alan. Thank you, Jutta. Thank you for a very interesting presentation. I totally agree with you, but I wonder if you make some reflection on the fact that when you talk political economy, we are maybe should distinguish, share between the public impact and the private impact. I mean, if we consider the impact on the private sector and how our research are impacting on the strategy of private, I mean, a big company or big enterprise that can really take advantages of our research. What I see is that, of course, small, medium enterprises are not able to catch the impact of the research, not only in agricultural economy, but maybe in other sectors, or they can do through, I don't know, extension services or something like that, while a big enterprise, big company can have advantages of that. I see what's happened, For instance, in the case of the Nutri-Score debate, for instance, what's happened when in the debate on the EFSA, if you see the report of EFSA and how research can impact on the decision to take advantages on some decisions that in the end are reflect the political strategies of EFSA, and so EFSA is a public institution, but really impact on the behavior of the citizen, if you want. And of course in marketing, the use of label, the use of some implication of research. I'm thinking the neuromarketing, for instance, is very, some company really applied that. And there are a lot of studies, a lot of research that drive the behavior of this company. Of course, in the side of rural development, of agricultural policy, is the impact. I see that is much more public, is very, very low, very low, and so is another issue at which level is a central level, I mean European level, national or regional? No, because it's different. There are different centers or stakeholders who have the power to decide the type of implication or the decision related to common agricultural policy. I don't know if it was just a consideration more than a question, but the way to say thank you very much to join us. Thank you.
Hey, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Filippo. I would add another quick question. So it's also related to this debate of influencing the policy makers, the policy agenda being very impactful. So one of the very much emerging, but it's not even emerging. It's a topic that everyone hear about I would say every hour. Climate change. So role of communication on consumers when it comes to climate change issues. So do you have an idea on if there is any need of making more research on labels to communicate approaches that are good for climate change issues? That's for Jutta, of course. And the same will be for Alan. It comes without saying how really we can shape the agricultural common policy in order to be effective for climate change. I'll stop here.
Jutta, would you like to take the labeling question, and I think also Filippo's question on the relevance of research to the private sector is probably more in your area, and I'll come back on the second part of Fabio's question. Yeah.
Okay, well, regarding climate change and labels, I mean, I guess climate change is a prime example of an environmental externality, and we know that private decision making will not fully take care of this externality problem. I think we have been focusing a lot on information policies in the past, and that to an extent has enabled the consumer to make better decisions, but on the other hand also put a lot of burden and responsibility on the consumer. And I'm not always sure if it's not an easy way out for business or also governments to simply say, well, if the consumer doesn't save the world, then there's nothing to be done. So I think that's why we have more governance structures that should also take up their responsibility. And I think labels are very effective for within product category decisions, but maybe less so for like overall decisions. And we know, for instance, from the Lancet study, that we need very big consumption changes and not product A versus product B within the category need to be exchanged. So that's my take on the climate change. And yeah, I think Filippo is very right. So who benefits from our research also in the private sector? Well, if the conclusion is that it's a big business that is rather benefiting than the small business, maybe also institutional research programs at the regional and national and also EU governmental research programs have to think about how to design research programs. I would say it's not always only bad things. Some things are just simply expensive and require an investment, and that's easier to be done by big business. So if, for instance, one looks at the criticism vis-a-vis the EFSA on the regulation of functional food claims, of course, their decision very much promoted claims being done by big companies who can afford human intervention studies. But I'm not sure that the better solution would be to have a lot of claims that are not substantiated by scientific evidence. So maybe it's more hand-in-hand working that is required here to help also more dispersed sectors to come up with claims if then there's scientific evidence to support them. So I think, yeah, I guess it's a frequent or it's a continuous struggle to try to not only think about like who can benefit, but also like how to design then research programs and funds.
Maybe just to say a word on your other question, Fabio, the really important one, how can we incentivize the necessary changes in agriculture to reduce emissions and increase removals? And clearly, we have not succeeded to date. I mean, the evidence is that since 2005, agricultural emissions have more or less stabilized, and without policy change, the projections forwarded to the European Environment Agency up to 2035 suggest, no real change in that trend. You're talking about maybe 4 to 5% emissions reported projected by member states. So we really do need to make much better use of the instruments that we have. I think there's some reasons why the results have been so modest to date. It's clear that we don't really have targets for reducing agricultural emissions. They're kind of hidden within the more general effort sharing regulation target that every member state has. There's clearly limited portfolio of technical and management interventions. And there's been a huge reluctance to contemplate reductions in activity, and particularly in animal agriculture, which seems to be critical to actually getting significant reductions in emissions. What I find very interesting, the Commission, as everyone will be aware, has been pushing this idea of carbon farming as a kind of new revenue stream for farmers. So the idea is to pay farmers to sequester carbon, mainly in soils, of course, through afforestation and agroforestry maybe as well. And there is a need, which the Commission recognizes, for a sort of regulatory framework to ensure the credibility and the integrity of any credits that are generated in this way. But it always struck me as strange that we are thinking about using a market mechanism when it comes to the removal of carbon dioxide, but we don't use a market mechanism to try to limit the emissions. There is no price, no value put on emissions. So farmers don't take that into account in their decision making. So I found it very interesting in the recent communication on sustainable carbon cycles from the Commission that they are actually promising now to conduct a study looking at the application of the polluter pays principle
if it's not just me, we have again technical problems, do we?
Yes.
It's really a pity because I think that we were really going to a very important conclusion. But you know, the clock is really a tyranny in this case, and we are already 6 minutes above the limit. So I would start the conclusive part, unless there are final questions for Jutta. And if not, I will say I will slowly approach to the end of this, just slow, so that if Alan is back on time, then we can conclude this, thanking him for the very insightful speech and discussion that we had. But I must say that if not, I want to really thank everyone that has joined. I want to thank the speakers. I want to thank really the board again, and all the members of the executive committee of the association, the president, past president, the new president. I want to emphasize once again that these webinars are possible due to the strong cooperation of the journal and the association. And in fact, the journal is run by the association. And of course, I want to take advantage of being all here to really encourage to submit papers to bio-based and applied economics. And once again, I want to thank the new members of the editorial board. So I think it's we're really close to be ready to say hi. I don't know if anyone wants to give a final speech on that. If we were in person, would have been much nicer, but you know, we are all really really much used to being in webinars. So thank you very much again, and I hope you enjoyed, and you will hear from us on the next webinars. Some of you have asked in the chat if the slides will be available. We are planning actually to make registration and slides available if the speakers will give us the permission to do so. So if you have missed anything, you probably can read or see again the presentations. So thank you very much, and I wish you a great rest of the day and a great weekend. Bye-bye.
Hello, goodbye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.